right, well, I'm going to take a slightly different tack, but I think it's complementary to what's been said here, and that has to do with the sharp rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia following the October 7th attacks of last year. Before I get into that too much, the impacts on two very vulnerable communities, Jews and Muslim/Arabs, I want to emphasize that the impact of hate that we've seen in those areas have been exacerbated by the insufficient and outdated regulation that we've seen, coupled with a collapse in the trust and safety mechanisms of social media platforms. We all saw that. The biggest example of that are the riots this past summer. And although we need to see how the implementation of the EU's Digital Services Act and the Online Safety Act proceed, this still leaves us vulnerable to exploitation of our online spaces, to target vulnerable communities with disinformation, harassment, or worse. So for anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in particular, we have added difficulties. The biggest one is the conflation of the Israel-Gaza-Lebanon conflict with both forms of hate. And also, do we understand the nuances of this within content moderation? Do we understand the cultural dynamic and motivations around the conflict? And finally, in the political space, political parties, those of course who are responsible for our legislation, they haven't effectively bridged the gap in a very, very turbulent election year. And we've seen the ramifications of this in both the UK elections and the US elections. So basically no one is helping mitigate this. We've seen this now for a year. We've seen lip service paid to it. We've seen both communities crying out for action to be done and very little movement. And I'm speaking as someone who's spent over 30 years working in interfaith spaces. And we've seen evidence of the harassment online and offline, hate crimes and violence. We do, of course, our own research and trend analysis on both of these. And the important thing for both of these also is that both of these communities have traditionally been targets of the far right. We saw this in Pittsburgh, in the Tree of Life shooting. We saw this in Christchurch. But in the past year, I've seen anecdotally and otherwise that each of these communities have increasingly targeted each other. And again, as someone who's spent many, many years in interfaith, this just breaks my heart. So when we look at applied communication strategies to help mitigate this, what can be done? And I've spent a lot of the last year explicitly just focusing on this. And I'm reminded of Dr. Marshall Ganz's principles of public narrative, and I think they could be kind of instructive here, and I've applied this where I could. Dr. Marshall Ganz is a well-known grassroots organizer. He's a lecturer at Harvard, and he's responsible for the organizing of Barack Obama's 2008 campaign. I've had the honor of studying under Dr. Ganz, and he spells out three key narrative structures: the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. This applies to leaders in these two communities who I work with regularly. And what this means for those leaders is they need to answer who they are as leaders. They need to understand what defines their community. And then finally, they need to craft a narrative on how to address the injustices as they perceive it. So a lot of leaders within these organizations are frankly circling the wagons. They feel besieged. They're defining these things in a very sort of insular way. And these communities are generally not speaking to each other, even though they're both suffering. So I've advised these leaders, both Jewish and Muslim, to rethink their idea of community from solely religious ones to human-centered ones. So looking at fellow citizens, neighbors, fellow students, coworkers. These are the spaces that we've seen conflict and disruption, particularly with anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And an emphasis on proximity and shared values rather than identity is really, really important. What we've studied over the years, campaigns against hate and extremism, we've seen greater impact on local levels with close proximities, rather than online or more broadly, even if the campaigns used on national levels depict a local reality. So how do we address all this in practice? So when the grievances have dominated all other forms of communication and effectively radicalized people. So our research right after October 7th online showed a spike of between 43 and 51 times, not percentage, but fold, increases of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism respectively from ordinary people watching videos on YouTube. On the ground, that equated to between a 200 and 300% increase in hate crimes. We talk a lot about leveraging the voices of faith leaders in countering the narratives of extremist groups like ISIS and Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda, but we haven't come close to leveraging those voices effectively enough to tackle Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. So yes, I'm talking about rabbis and imams, but I'm talking about more Jewish and Muslim voices in general that need to be involved in this. In the town that I live in the north of England, within a few weeks of October 7th, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim leaders got together with elected officials and made a public pledge not to allow the conflict to damage their wider community. This happened in a few other cities in Europe and North America, but very few. But not only has there not been any tension in my community since, but all of these faith groups rallied around the Muslim community when they were threatened by the riots by the far right this summer. So viewed this way, the solutions aren't that complicated. So the interesting aspect of all this is I find myself now working directly with large Fortune 500 companies, coping with a growing amount of intolerance between their employees. So these are companies with hundreds of thousands of employees globally. They are essentially a form of community. And about 70% of the cases that we're dealing with these companies are anti-Semitism and Islamophobia equally, with the rest being racism, anti-LGBT, and others. Much of this is fed by the global online trends of hate and disinformation that we ourselves track and others. And much of this, of course, we've been talking about, amplified by AI and other trends. But the answers require human responses between employees and employers. Building empathy, as we all know, when you're physically present is much easier than through an online campaign. So this is one of the spaces where an online campaign is less important than a strategy that involves human interaction. Again, research overwhelmingly shows that this that supports this. So in practice, that means a better awareness of hate amongst employees, better support for the trauma that they face, a better understanding of hate by corporate leadership, and a set of responses that are rehabilitative when they need to be and punitive when they need to be. And that's a really key difference. In my initial discussions with companies, these are very educated, intelligent people. They weren't aware. They had no understanding of how to apply their authority when it comes to allegations of hate, reports of being targeted, understanding memes and nuances or what have you that employees are sharing, how employees are targeting each other. Gauging intent behind it, whether something was inadvertent or not. So all of this has ramifications on the cohesion of the workplace, reputation, legal risk, a whole bunch of things. And all of this essentially needs to be underpinned by a collective corporate narrative that is not dissimilar from the narratives that we encourage communities to have to build resilience. So, by the way, none of the actions that we're talking about involve surveillance or censorship or violations of privacy or infringing on the rights of people to advocate strongly for the causes that they believe in. That's a really, really important point. All we're trying to do is provide guardrails. So these companies are in fact, and unfortunately I don't have a lot of data to share with you because we are in the middle of this for the last several months, but they're turning into laboratories where the impact of hate can be mitigated beyond what tech companies and government regulators or even researchers like ourselves can provide. And while technology will continue to play a part in the overall response, these two forms of hate, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, remind us of the importance of a human element and local responses. So hopefully we can share the lessons that we learn and support the victims of other forms of hate and extremism.